sharing of constructing spatial proximity for different kind of populations. So I will stop here. I think I hope I didn't go further than 13 minutes. Merci beaucoup.
That was absolutely perfect timing. Thank you very much, Chudley, and a very interesting discussion. I'm going to move right on now to Christina to start with the next presentation. And I would like to again encourage people to put any questions or comments into the chat so that we can round up questions for all of the presenters once we've heard all three of the presentations.
Okay.
Okay, I'm just trying to look for my clock. All right, so first of all, thank you for the opportunity to share some of our findings and to receive some feedback from you about how our chapter should unfold. First of all, I should say I'm at Carleton and not Concordia. There are great people at Concordia. Would love to work with them, but I'm at Carleton. So I do want to say that that the chapter that we're trying to pull together is very much a collaborative effort. It brings together members from the International Student Working Group, including Margaret Walton-Roberts, Kitchener-Waterloo, Lisa Alfieri-Slayton at York Region, Francine Schlosser from Windsor, and Shutama Ghosh in Toronto, as well. And I'm drawing on the insights of Louisa Vronis as well. So in the chapter, what we are trying to do is to draw on these collaborative projects, as well as some of the insights from the research digests that have already been published, and more recently from the International Student webinar. So the starting point of the chapter is to think about the concept of social resilience. And at the moment, we're thinking about in relation, like a working definition that Akbar and Preston put out to think about the international student experience in Canada. And in doing so, we anticipate that we're going to have to work through some of the tensions that mirror some of our conversations in the partnership as a whole, in terms of thinking about individual resilience, as well as, you know, these broader conceptualizations of social resilience. So in order to sort of get ourselves thinking about this chapter and to think about how to proceed, we convened a meeting among the members in the different city networks. And in each instance, the members came to think about the international student experience, albeit from slightly different vantage points, which reflect their research. So my point here is the chapter is still part of an ongoing conversation. What I'm doing is presenting some of our initial thoughts. So in terms of the chapter, we're proposing to consider how student experience of migration governance and social supports moves across various scales to capture the dynamics of the different projects. And so, for instance, the research conducted touches on, you know, the transnational domain. It touches on the federal government's policy regime vis-a-vis international students, on individual universities and the role they play in hindering or fostering social resilience, and on the impact of the local community. So while we sort of capture these different dynamics, all the research projects are located in Ontario, the province with the highest number of students. But in Ottawa, our group also included both English and French-speaking students. So the way we proceeded with our conversation in terms of trying to flesh out this chapter was to take the questions posed as goals by the editors and try to you know, add our thoughts or our initial thoughts about those questions. And that's how I've structured this talk, insofar as the talk reflects our conversation. So the first question asked about the merits of a resilience approach to settlement. And the question as posed might have to be reconsidered in terms of the group that we're talking about, insofar as international students have a precarious status. And while many of them may want to stay in Canada using a pathway such as the postgraduate work permit, others don't. And so that might be something to think about. But the other issue about international students' precarious status is that they're located at a set of very contradictory dynamics. So on the one hand, they're encouraged to come to Canada, even recruited actively to come to Canada as part of its two-step process, and they may want the status of a permanent resident. But the current institutional framework, or at least the governance framework of immigration regulations, for instance, works against them in many instances. For example, the work students do on campus is not always counted. And international students themselves might fall between the cracks in terms of support because they're unable to access existing settlement services. And local immigration partnerships may have long waiting lists. And some community agencies that provide services to international students do so, but they're not necessarily funded to do so. So the very status of international students is implicated in a broader framework of precarity. Similarly, the institutional framework is not always responsive, or not necessarily responsive to international students' concerns, and this has implications for the broader issue of resilience. So if you consider the recent announcement of the pathway to permanent residence for international students, and here I'm just highlighting some of the points the Migrant Rights Network has made based on a survey they did. The criteria still will exclude as many as 34% of their survey respondents on the basis of the fact the criteria, says you have to be graduated after a certain time, you have to have a certain level of education, you need an existing current work permit, and the broader issue of being ready with language accreditation. So those kinds of criteria push people out. If we turn to the second question posed by the editors, how do formal and informal institutions play a role here? One issue to consider is and because many of us did research within particular post-secondary institutions, is the extent to which those institutions step into the gap to provide some service. So, and here, whether it's on the basis of information regarding work permit or rules for work or health services on the one hand, but on the other hand, there are other kinds of issues that come to the fore. The federal government has rules as to what universities can or can't do vis-a-vis international students. There might also be, in terms of the way universities are set up, there might be differences that frame international students' experiences. So some of the research we've done here in Ottawa seems to suggest that students at Carleton might have greater issues regarding finances than students in Ottawa, and that might be something to look at. But the other point in respect to this question that's also important is to think of what types of civil society groups have also offered assistance. And here, certainly research in Kitchener-Waterloo indicates that some denominational churches and their parishioners have come to play a role. We can think about the extent to which international students themselves have made links in the communities that they're located in terms of just neighborliness. Your neighbors might help you. The third question, which is sort of related to the points I've just made about formal and informal institution is the broader issue of the urban context. So obviously, students, even with precarious status, are members of broader communities and reliant on public goods. And research in Kitchener, Waterloo, and Windsor raises the interesting point about the nature of a public infrastructure and how that plays a role in students' experiences. And the examples that they brought to the fore is just the issue of public transport, for instance. But also, you know, there are students make calculated bargains. So certainly in Ottawa, some students might prefer to live on the Quebec side in Gatineau because the housing costs are cheaper. That leads to being at a further distance from the university, but that's a bargain. The last question asked about thinking about the merits of the resilience approach, including analysis of responses to COVID. So more broadly than that question, I think COVID was a wake-up call to educational institutions and the federal government as to how the system is so dependent on international students. So a recent report from Parliament said in 2018, there were 721,000 international students studying in Canada, and they contributed 21.6 billion to the country's gross domestic product, which I think is not insignificant. So I think also COVID made visible the extent to which some post-secondary institutions are reliant on international students, and by extension, their contribution to the Canadian economy. But also, I think international students also provide skills and talent to the economy. So in some, as kind of, and this is as one of the members of the group put it, international students are often viewed as a remedy to all social and economic consequences, including those that stem from ill-planned government practices. And I thought that captured it nicely. So the ability of international students to navigate the ongoing pandemic is framed by the broader environment. Some supports are evident, but in many instances, those supports as constructed tended to overlook the specifics of international student experience. And there's some evidence to support that both through the parliamentary committee's work, but also, for instance, in Ottawa, students reported, the ones that I was able to interview post-pandemic, that they were unable to access supports the government put in place because of the criteria, and that simply university emergency funds were not enough. So, and additionally, the government did move to allow students from abroad to continue with their studies remotely, but there were many disruptions. And there were also issues around, you know, access to technology and the time when things were offered. The border and travel restrictions meant many students could not go home, or they could not come to Canada. And many students were delayed staying in Canada, and that's a financial hardship. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I think that is it. I think in relation to that last question, though, I think the COVID, the ongoing pandemic has made more visible the things that many of us already knew or suspected about the existing inequities that international students face while they're here in Canada. So I'm going to stop there. Thanks.